They gave him money for a seat in first class, but denied him the dignity of a meal. On a luxury flight, a black CEO sat in first class, expecting respect and equality. But when the meals arrived, everyone around him was served except him. The humiliation was sharp, the silence unbearable, and the stares unforgettable. What the crew didn't know was that this quiet man of power was about to turn their arrogance into a lesson the world would never forget. The CEO, dressed sharply in a tailored suit, smiled politely as the trays were passed. But when his turn came, the flight attendant leaned close and whispered coldly, "We've run out." His chest tightened. He looked around. Every passenger feasted. His plate was empty, but his silence spoke volumes. He sat there, his fingers interlocked tightly on his lap, every muscle in his body resisting the urge to break the silence. He had bought the most expensive seat on the aircraft, not because he needed to show his wealth, but because comfort had been earned through years of sweat, sacrifice, and endless nights of work. First class was supposed to represent more than just a seat, was a symbol of recognition, a place where respect was implied, not questioned. But in that moment, with his tray glaringly empty while others unwrapped their silver cutlery and relished hot meals, the weight of humiliation pressed heavily against his chest. The smell of freshly prepared chicken and delicate sauces drifted around him, almost taunting him. The clinking of forks and knives became sharper than any insult. He swallowed hard, glancing once more at the flight attendant. Her smirk was faint, but it was the dismissive curl of her lips that said more than her words ever could. She didn't see a powerful leader of a multinational company. She didn't see the man who had built an empire from nothing. All she saw was his skin color, and in her eyes, that was enough to deny him what everyone else had been given. His mind drifted back to his childhood. Growing up, he had always been told he would need to work twice as hard, climb higher, and prove himself again and again just to stand equal. And so, he had done just that. He stayed late when others went home. He studied when others slept. He knocked on doors that never opened and built doors of his own when the world refused him entry. He wore resilience like armor, and every scar in his journey was proof of his unshakable will. Yet here he was, decades later, a titan of industry, sitting quietly with an empty tray, humiliated in front of strangers on a flight he had paid handsomely for. But anger was not his way. He had learned long ago that anger consumed, while silence built strength. He let the moment pass externally, but inside he was writing a memory, etching every detail of the humiliation into his mind. His heart beat steadily, his breaths measured, but his eyes burned with quiet fire. He knew who he was, and he knew what power truly meant. The other passengers stole glances. Some shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the wrong but lacking the courage to speak. Others avoided eye contact altogether, unwilling to disturb their own comfort for the sake of another's dignity. The CEO noticed it all, the whispers, the quick glances, the indifference. He smiled faintly to himself, a smile not of joy, but of acknowledgement. People rarely spoke when justice demanded their voices. That was the way of the world. The hours of the flight stretched long. His stomach growled, but hunger was nothing new to him. He had once gone days without food as a boy, surviving on scraps and determination. Compared to those days, this was nothing but an insult, and insults could be endured. He closed his eyes and rested his head back, shutting out the sight of glistening plates and satisfied passengers. In his silence, he was planning. As the plane descended and the wheels kissed the runway, a different kind of anticipation filled his chest. The humiliation he had endured was not his alone. It was a reflection of countless others who had been dismissed, ignored, or devalued simply for who they were. He would not let it slide, not for revenge, but for justice. When the seatbelt sign dimmed, he rose gracefully. His presence was commanding even in stillness. The crew avoided his gaze, but he felt their unease. Without raising his voice, without a single word of confrontation, he collected his briefcase and walked toward the exit. Outside, the airport lights glistened on the polished floor. His chauffeur was already waiting, but he did not head straight for the car. Instead, he made a call that would change the course of that flight crew's future. Within hours, word traveled through the corridors of the airline's corporate headquarters. The CEO had arrived unannounced. The man whose company partnered with their airline, whose investments ensured their global reach, was standing calmly in their executive office, and he was not pleased. He didn't rant, he didn't rage. He simply recounted the events, his tone steady, his words precise. Every detail of the flight, every look of dismissal, every whisper of insult, he laid them all out like evidence in a trial. And then he paused, letting silence weigh heavily in the boardroom. The executives squirmed. They knew who sat before them. This was not a man to be brushed aside. His company's name was stitched into their profits. His influence stretched beyond numbers. Losing his trust meant losing millions. And more than that, it meant losing respect in circles where respect mattered most. He leaned forward, his voice calm yet unyielding. Respect is not a privilege. It is the bare minimum, and when those representing you cannot give it, they represent something worse than incompetence. They represent arrogance. That is a risk I cannot afford to align with. The silence that followed was deafening. Papers shuffled, throats cleared, but no one dared speak against him. The decision was swift. The crew who had humiliated him were dismissed, not because he demanded it with rage, but because his presence alone carried the weight of undeniable truth. That night, as he sat in his penthouse overlooking the city, he reflected not on the dismissal, but on the meaning of what had happened. He thought of every child growing up with the same color of skin, every young dreamer being told they were less, every hard-working soul enduring quiet humiliations just to survive another day. He had not acted for himself alone. He had acted to remind the world that silence is not weakness. Silence can be the sharpest weapon, waiting for the right moment to strike with precision. His phone buzzed with messages, some from allies commending him, some from strangers who had already caught wind of the story. It spread quickly, as such stories often do. Some called it justice, others called it power. But he knew it was neither. It was a reminder that respect cannot be bought, but it must always be given freely. As dawn broke and the first light poured into his room, he rose from his chair. He knew there would be another challenge tomorrow, another insult, another battle to fight quietly. But he also knew this: the man who holds his silence holds his power. And when he chooses to speak, the world has no choice but to listen. The flight crew had underestimated him, thinking he was just another passenger. They saw an empty plate, but what they missed was the fullness of his resolve. They saw a silent man, but what they failed to recognize was the storm behind his silence. And storms, no matter how long they wait, always arrive with force. That day, somewhere in the world, a young boy sat in a classroom, dreaming of becoming someone great, and perhaps, one day, when the world tried to deny him too, he would remember this story not of a CEO and his empty plate, but of a man who turned humiliation into strength, and silence into change. He stayed calm, refusing to argue. Instead, he folded his hands, eyes burning with quiet pain. Passengers whispered. Some pitied him, others ignored. The flight crew smirked, assuming he was powerless. But in that silence, a decision had already been made. Justice would come, not with anger, but with authority. The hum of the aircraft filled the void, blending with the occasional laughter of passengers enjoying their meals, the clink of glasses, and the low murmur of conversation. Yet, beneath that superficial calm, his silence radiated like a storm held tightly within. It was not the silence of weakness, not the silence of someone afraid to speak, but the silence of a man who had already decided that words in this moment were unnecessary. Words, after all, would do nothing against those who had already chosen to see him as less. He knew better. His life had been a series of moments like this, each one a reminder that he could not afford to lose control, that his dignity was not for them to take away, no matter how hard they tried. He adjusted the cuffs of his suit with slow precision, the shine of his watch catching the dim cabin light. His movements were deliberate. Controlled an image of a man unshaken, even while his heart bore the weight of insult. The attendants passed by again, avoiding his eyes, their confidence fed by the assumption that their small act of cruelty would go unnoticed, that his quietness was proof of submission. But they had made a mistake, a grave one. They had mistaken restraint for powerlessness, silence for surrender. Inside his mind he revisited the years that had forged him into who he was. The long nights of work, the endless rejection letters, the faces of those who told him he would never make it beyond a certain level because of the color of his skin. He remembered walking into boardrooms filled with men who looked nothing like him, their eyes sharp with doubt, their words dripping with condescension. He had been underestimated his entire life, written off before being given a chance to prove himself. And yet, here he was, a CEO, a leader, a man whose signature could move millions, whose words could shift markets. Every time someone doubted him, every time someone tried to humiliate him, he had turned that pain into power. This would be no different. The whispers in the cabin grew faint, though he could still feel the weight of them pressing against him. Some passengers looked away, burying their faces into their meals, unwilling to involve themselves. Others offered sympathetic glances, their eyes soft, yet their lips sealed. Sympathy was cheap. He had no need for their pity. What he wanted, what he demanded was respect. Not through confrontation, not through loud declarations, but through action. The kind of action that would remind everyone involved that dignity was not something to be denied without consequence. Minutes turned into hours as the plane cut through the clouds. His hunger gnawed at him, but he barely noticed it anymore. Hunger was nothing compared to humiliation, and he had endured far greater hardships in his journey. He closed his eyes for a moment, shutting out the sound of forks scraping plates, shutting out the image of attendants walking past without a glance. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he could see his plan taking shape. He didn't need to raise his voice here. He didn't need to remind the attendants of who he was. They would learn soon enough. The aircraft began its descent, the captain's voice breaking through the silence with rehearsed professionalism. Seatbelts clicked, trays were lifted, and the cabin adjusted itself for landing. But while others prepared for the end of their journey, he was preparing for the beginning of something else. His silence had not been for them. It had been for himself, to contain the fire until the right moment. And that moment was almost here. As the wheels touched the runway and the plane rolled to a stop, the CEO remained still. He allowed the crowd to shuffle out, row by row, people collecting their bags, whispering final conversations, the cabin buzzing with the relief of arrival. He did not rush. He never rushed. Patience had always been his ally, and today it would serve him again. When the last passenger had stepped out, he finally rose. His tall frame and sharp suit made him stand out immediately. He adjusted his tie, picked up his leather briefcase, and walked slowly toward the exit. The flight attendants stood there, plastering on their professional smiles, pretending nothing had happened. Their masks could not fool him. He caught the flicker of unease in their eyes, the faint recognition that perhaps they had misjudged the man they chose to belittle, but it was too late for them now. The decision had already been made. The moment his polished shoes touched the ground of the terminal, he pulled his phone from his pocket. With calm precision, he dialed a number. His voice was steady, low, carrying no anger, no raised tones, just authority, the kind of authority that did not need to shout, because it was undeniable. Within minutes, arrangements were made. By the time he stepped into his waiting car, the chain of consequences had already been set into motion. At the airline's headquarters, executives scrambled. His name carried weight, far more than the attendants on that flight could have ever imagined. He wasn't just any passenger, he was one of their most influential partners. A man whose decisions affected the very foundation of their business. To humiliate him was not just a failure of service, it was a failure of judgment. And when judgment failed at this level, repercussions were inevitable. In the boardroom, he spoke with the same calm that he had maintained on the flight. He did not embellish. He did not exaggerate. He simply laid out the facts as they had occurred, describing the smirks, the dismissal, the whispers, and the humiliation of being denied the basic courtesy every other passenger had received. His words were deliberate, each one heavy with the weight of truth. The executives listened in silence, shifting uncomfortably in their chairs, knowing there was no defense strong enough to protect them from the reality he described. And then, he paused. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady, his voice dropping lower. "This is not about a meal," he said. "This is about respect. Respect for your passengers, respect for your partners, respect for the very foundation of your business. And when that respect is denied, when arrogance replaces courtesy, it is not just a failure of individuals, it is a failure of your institution. That is not a risk I am willing to ignore." The room fell silent. His words hung in the air, undeniable, inescapable. The decision was immediate. The crew that had mocked him, dismissed him, humiliated him, they were dismissed themselves. Their arrogance had cost them their careers. Their careless cruelty had ended their tenure. It was not vengeance. It was justice, delivered not in anger, but in authority. That night, as he sat in his penthouse, the city lights sprawling out beneath him, he reflected on what had happened. He did not celebrate, for this was not a victory. It was a reminder that no matter how high he climbed, no matter how much he achieved, there would always be those who tried to pull him down with small acts of cruelty. But it was also a reminder of something greater, that dignity could never be taken from him unless he allowed it, and that silence, when used wisely, could be more powerful than any shout. He poured himself a glass of water and stared out into the night sky. The stars shone faintly above the city glow, distant yet steady. He thought of the young men and women who would hear his story, who would learn that silence is not surrender, that patience is not weakness. He thought of every child who would one day face the same kind of dismissal he had faced on that flight, and how this story would remind them that justice does not always come from noise, but from quiet, steady strength. The attendants had seen an empty tray and assumed it was the end of the story. They had not realized that in that emptiness lay a decision, a turning point, a reminder that power is often invisible until it chooses to reveal itself. They had mistaken his calm for defeat, his silence for compliance. But now they knew silence, in the hands of the right man, could be the sharpest weapon of all. And as the city continued to breathe beneath him, he allowed himself the faintest of smiles. Justice had been served, not with anger, not with vengeance, but with authority. The storm within him had waited patiently, and when it finally moved, it changed everything. When the plane landed, the CEO walked straight to the airline's executive office. With one phone call, contracts shifted, careers ended, and the entire crew was dismissed. For the CEO, it wasn't revenge, it was a reminder that respect costs nothing, yet means everything. And sometimes, silence isn't weakness. It's the storm before change. The airport was alive with its usual chaos, passengers dragging suitcases, families embracing, announcements echoing through high ceilings, the metallic wheels of trolleys clattering against polished floors. Amidst the noise, he moved like a shadow of authority. Every step measured, his polished shoes striking softly yet leaving an invisible mark that followed him wherever he went. He did not look hurried, nor did he carry himself with the frantic pace of travelers rushing to their next gate. His composure alone made heads turn. The driver waiting outside recognized the look in his eyes instantly. This was not the calm gaze of a man returning from a trip. It was the cold, deliberate focus of someone who had endured an insult too sharp to be brushed aside. The chauffeur opened the car door with a bow of respect, but the CEO raised a hand, signaling he would not yet sit. He lifted his phone, dialed a number known only to a select few, and spoke a single line. Arrange a meeting at headquarters. Now, the ripple began immediately. In the airline's executive towers, messages flashed across screens. Calls were answered with urgency. Assistants rushed to prepare boardrooms. His name carried weight heavier than contracts and louder than any threat. When he summoned, people moved. The executives knew he did not waste his time with trivialities. If he was coming to them directly, it meant something grave had happened. He entered the car finally, settling into the leather seats. His eyes fixed out the window as the city blurred by. Neon lights flashed across his reflection in the glass, but his mind was far away. He thought about the silence he had held on the plane, the whispers of passengers, the smirk of the attendant, the sharp sting of being denied not a meal, but respect. That was what burned most, the realization that after everything he had achieved, after all the barriers he had broken, there were still those who believed he could be humiliated and dismissed as if he were nothing. The car pulled up to the glass facade of the airline's headquarters, a towering building that glowed in the evening light. The staff at the entrance recognized him instantly, their postures stiffening, their greetings formal. He acknowledged none of it, walking through the revolving doors with the quiet authority of someone who had no need to announce himself. His presence was the announcement. In the boardroom, the atmosphere was tense. Executives sat waiting, their eyes darting to the door every few seconds. Files were shuffled nervously, glasses of water remained untouched. When he finally stepped in, the air shifted. The room straightened as though gravity itself had deepened. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He placed his briefcase on the table, clicked it open, and withdrew a single document, a contract, thick with signatures and terms. This, he began, his voice calm but commanding, is what binds us together. This is why your planes take off with the strength of our partnership behind them. And this is why I expected better. No one spoke. His words hung heavy, cutting through the silence like a blade. He recounted the events of the flight, each detail precise and measured. He did not dramatize. He did not need to. The humiliation spoke for itself, the denial of service, the dismissive smirk, the whispered pity of passengers, the silence of those who should have known better. Respect, he continued, leaning forward slightly, his eyes scanning the faces before him, is not a luxury. It is not a service you give when convenient. It is the foundation of every interaction, every partnership, every human connection. When your employees fail to show it, they do not simply fail me, they fail your entire institution. One of the executives cleared his throat, as if to speak, but the CEO's eyes cut to him sharply, and the words died in his throat. There was no room for excuses here. They all knew it. He made a single call from his phone right there in the boardroom. His voice was steady, low, yet each word carried the force of command. In less than 3 minutes, the fate of the crew who had mocked him was sealed. Their careers ended, their arrogance costing them more than they could have imagined. The executives watched in stunned silence as the man, with no raised voice, no outward display of rage, altered the course of lives with the ease of someone accustomed to wielding immense power. But when the call ended, he did not smile. There was no satisfaction in his face, no triumph in his eyes. Instead, he looked at the room again, his voice quieter now, almost sorrowful. This was not for me. This was not about a meal. This was about a lesson. A reminder to all of you, and to everyone you represent. Respect costs nothing. Yet when it is denied, the price is far too high. The room remained silent. No one dared to argue. No one dared to challenge him. He closed his briefcase slowly, rose to his feet, and left the room without another word. His footsteps echoed in the long hallway, steady and unbroken, a rhythm that sounded more final than any gavel. Later that night, in his penthouse overlooking the skyline, he sat alone by the glass windows. The city sparkled below, alive with energy, but he sat still, a glass of water in his hand, his mind replaying the day's events. He thought of how easily the attendants had dismissed him, how casually they had decided his dignity was less valuable than others. And he thought of how fragile respect had become in a world where arrogance often masqueraded as authority. For him, the dismissal of the crew was not revenge. It was not about punishing individuals. It was about sending a message, a ripple that would spread through the halls of power, down through every rank of the airline, and perhaps beyond. A message that dignity is not negotiable, that silence is not surrender, that sometimes the quietest man in the room is the one who carries the loudest storm. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the night sky. His entire life had been a lesson in patience and resilience, from the days of his youth when he had been told he would never rise above his station, to the battles in boardrooms where his voice had been doubted until it reshaped entire industries. He had learned to wield silence like a weapon, not the silence of fear, but the silence of power. The silence that waits, observes, and then strikes at the right moment. He thought of the passengers on that flight, the ones who pitied him, the ones who ignored him, the ones who whispered but said nothing. They too had been part of the lesson. The world was full of silent witnesses, people too afraid to act, too comfortable to speak, and yet, change never came from comfort. Change came from the few who carried storms in their silence, who waited for the right moment to remind the world that dignity was not a privilege but a right. His phone buzzed with messages, statements from the airline, apologies crafted with polished words, attempts to mend what had been broken. He read them quietly, his face expressionless. Words meant little without action, and he knew that only time would reveal whether they had truly learned the lesson. For him, the matter was settled. He had done what needed to be done, not for himself, but for the principle he had carried his entire life: respect above all else. The night stretched on, the city glowing like an ocean of stars beneath him. He raised his glass one final time before setting it aside, his reflection in the window merging with the lights of the city. Tomorrow, he knew, would bring new challenges, new battles to fight. But tonight, he allowed himself a moment of quiet victory, not in the downfall of others, but in the reminder that silence, when wielded with patience and authority, could move mountains. Respect costs nothing, yet it means everything, and those who forget that truth will always, sooner or later, pay the price. For the world does not change with shouts and noise alone. Sometimes, it changes with silence. Sometimes, silence is the storm before change.